We're going to start with Michael Kern from the Ruckelshaus Center, who's going to talk about their work on collaboration, and they were involved in the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. Then I think we're going to go secondly to Craig Thomas, who's introduced himself already, but he has done, as he said, work on collaboration for several decades. And we'll talk a little bit about where the thinking is on collaboration from a political science perspective. Then we'll go to Nicola, who's a graduate of the Stanford program, but now is teaching at Irvine. And I'm not sure which of her various projects she'll talk about, but she's been also looking at collaboration, particularly in FERC licensing, but more broadly as well. And then we'll finish with Gabriela, who is hopefully going to work with us on collaboration on the governance border in San Diego. So she's going to share some thoughts about what has and has not happened on that border, I think. But there may be other surprises in her talk, I don't know. So let's start with Michael Kern talking about the Ruckelshaus Center's work on collaboration. And you can do it from your chair or you can stand up here. It's up to you.
Do you have a preference?
Nope.
I can do either. I'll start down here. If you'd rather that I stand up. Not that tall, you may not notice the difference. But yeah, that's true. At least I can see the slides from here if I sit here. So can you hear me okay? I think this is on, but I want to make sure everyone can hear. Okay, great. Terrific. Just one quick correction. Actually, several members of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan Steering Committee are on our board, but we have not been directly involved in the plan. There's other folks who've done the facilitation there, so I don't want to take credit for someone else's good work. We have several processes that have been closely interacting with and following the integrated plan because of connections and all that, but we're not directly involved in the plan, so I just don't want to take credit for somebody else's work. What I do want to do today is maybe introduce some concepts about collaborative governance and university-based collaboration. So I want to introduce or reintroduce you to collaborative approaches to addressing public policy challenges. As Bruce mentioned, the vision and mission and work of the Ruckelshaus Center, for which I'm the director, as a university-based provider. So doing this, knowing that some of what I'm going to present will not be new to everybody. Many of you will be familiar with some of it. You may well have studied collaborative governance, participated in collaborative processes. Maybe there's even folks here who've led collaborative processes. But an important point is a lot of processes are being labeled as collaborations these days, and not all of them resemble what we at the Ruckelshaus Center think about when we think about collaborative governance. So I want to kind of define that so that we can compare and contrast as we move along and talk about it a little bit. I also want to mention the university-based approach and a network of centers we've been part of that does that. I brought some one-pagers about the center, so if you're interested, I'm happy to hand those out or leave them on a table. There's a lot of information on our website, and a number of things I'm going to say are really well encapsulated in an op-ed that the Evans School Review asked me to do a number of years ago. That's on our website too, so that would be, if you're going to read one other thing, you might want to take a look at that. So I'm going to have a number of slides. I'm going to try and go through them really quickly so I don't exceed my time. For too many people, I think collaborate just means work with other people with the inferred postscript of because you have to, which can inside mean that you're feeling something like the person in this cartoon. And the term collaborate, if you go to the dictionary, does literally mean to work together, to co-labor. Webster's first definition, to work jointly with others or together, especially in an intellectual endeavor. But collaborative governance means something more specific, and at its best, it's not entered into because you have to, but because you want to, or because you expect that you will achieve more by doing so. And this conference is called Collaboration and Compromise in the West, and I won't get into it now, but maybe during our conversation, there's a big difference between collaboration and compromise, both very important concepts, but very different that we might want to talk about a little bit. And in terms of the rural part of this agenda, many who work on rural issues, I think, have an uneasy relationship with collaboration. And many that I've worked with feel that they've often been pushed into processes that were described as collaborations that they saw as poorly designed, unlikely to meet their needs. They participated only because, I don't know if you ever heard the expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I think there's been some participation for that reason, and that they basically feared that the process would resemble Webster's second definition of collaboration, which is to cooperate or willingly assist an enemy or occupying force. And I'm trying to hopefully distinguish between that type of collaboration and the kind of work that we try to foster at the center. You'll be happy to know we are not going to talk about everything that is on this slide, but collaborative governance is still a maturing field. It's in a constant state of flux, lots of ideas and definitions and theories and subfields and fields. It uses the toolkit of what's called alternative dispute resolution, which really has its roots in legal, labor, and family sectors, also international diplomacy, and for over 40 years has been applied to public policy. A lot of that work has been done in natural resources for a variety of reasons we could talk about, as Kevin made reference to. Of the terms on the list, the one you'll hear me talking about from moving forward is collaborative governance, which academics have used for a while. Pracademics, like Kevin and myself and others in this room, use it more frequently. And now even just straight-up practitioners are using that term. It's getting some real currency when you apply these types of processes to public policy. So I have a few definitions of collaborative governance that have evolved over the last decade or maybe a little bit longer, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to read you the full definitions, but I just want to put up on the screen some of the key concepts. You can see across those three definitions, we're talking about developing lasting solutions, going beyond what any sector can achieve on its own, engaging both state and non-state stakeholders, a collective decision-making process. It's formal. It's consensus-oriented, and we should talk at some point, if we want, about what we've used the term consensus a couple times today, but you'll see one of my recurring lessons later is that you should have a clear definition of what that means. Engaging agencies and levels of government, the public, private, and civic spheres, and then maybe a very key phrase, this is from Emerson and Nabachi, which is kind of becoming the gold standard, carrying out a public purpose that could not otherwise be accomplished. This is another nice, meaty, complicated slide that if we had lots of time, I would unpack, and instead I'm just going to touch on. We've put this together based on work that colleagues have done. And the basic take-home here is that a collaborative process has phases, it has stages, and there generally are three big ones: a convening phase, an agreement-seeking phase, an implementation phase. That the convening phase includes assessing, planning, and organizing. The agreement seeking includes educating or establishing a common information base, negotiating and resolving, and then there's an implementation phase with monitoring, evaluating, adaptively management, thinking about succession planning and mentoring and institutionalizing, right? So this makes it look like it's this nice linear process. Look at how the arrows just go one direction. Look at how each column is the same width, as if all of these things take the same amount of time, and of course none of those things are true. There's a lot of circling back. Sometimes you're in one phase a little bit of time. And also our center is not always involved in every stage of a collaborative process. But in terms of the basics, I just wanted to at least put this up and point out that each of these phases is critical to a well-designed collaboration. Another slide that if we were doing a long presentation, we'd spend lots of time on. Take a quick look. This is a graphic, again, adapted from colleagues that shares some of the conditions for initiating a collaborative process. Not every challenge, not every wicked problem is going to lend itself to a collaborative governance solution. The conditions have to be ripe. Here are some of the things you think about. It's not exclusive, an inclusive list, but these are some of the important things you think about whether you've got a process on your hands that might be receptive to a collaborative solution. We have our own set of project criteria I'll put up real quickly later as well. But the point of all this is that when done right, I think this cartoon is a better description of how to think about collaborative governance. That the right set of ideas, perspectives, information, and resources can come together to create a cohesive whole that has wheels, excuse the pun, solves problems, addresses interests and needs. So now just talk a little bit about the university setting in the Ruckelshaus Center. This work, collaborative public policy, collaborative governance, is done from lots of institutional settings. Sole practitioners do it, private practice, NGOs, some folks within government, and also the academic setting, which is where we are set. Universities play a unique role. There's a variety of reasons why universities are a good place from which to do this work, which I think I should probably skip the list of reasons because in the interest of time, but I'd be really happy to go back over them. There's about 75 programs across the country that in one way or the other are at universities and working on collaborative governance. We're one of the founding members of the University Network for Collaborative Governance, which brings them together. So then I'll just wrap up real quickly by giving you a little bit of a sense for the Ruckelshaus Center as an example of one of those places. Yeah, just a couple quick slides again. I'm going to buzz through quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time. William D. Ruckelshaus Center, we're named for our founder and advisory board chair, may be familiar to some folks. We're devoted to his approach to collaborative problem solving. Bill's really a remarkable public and private sector leader in recent American history. For those who don't know, first and fifth director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He was one of the heroes of Watergate. He has played a seminal role in the environmental movement, in collaborative policymaking, won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. You can see our mission and our vision on the slide. We're about developing collaborative, durable, and effective solutions, and doing that at a university. We actually do it at 2 universities. We're a joint effort. We're hosted on the University of Washington side by the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, and at Washington State University by WSU Extension, which also provides our administration. And again, the one-pager in the website will tell you a lot more about us. Just a couple tidbits on our governance and funding. We're guided by a prominent and influential advisory board with leaders from a wide range of sectors, geographies, perspectives, the public and private sector, and we also have academic and legislative ex officio members whose position on the board goes with the work they do, not themselves as individuals. I'm seated next to one of those. The presidents, provosts, and a number of deans from both of our universities are on our board, including Dean Archibald from the Evans School, and Craig is is our faculty liaison and her alternate on the board. You can also see this picture is just a subset. It's an extremely large board, but a number of other names that have come up today are depicted. Bill Ruckelshaus is in that photo. So is Dan Evans, for whom the Evans School is named. He's on the board. Paul Ward from the Yakima Nation is on the board. And where's Urban? Did he have to leave? Urban Eberhard is also on the board, among a lot of other folks. Our funding is also really unique. It's a mix of public and private sources. We get a small amount of core funding, about 10% from the universities. The state legislature gives to the universities. We do about 60% fee for service, and about 30% we raise ourselves from donors. We have our own 501c3 foundation, and that mix really helps keep us strong, independent, and not too dependent on any one source. This is our project criteria, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you can see there's some overlap and also some differences between this and the set of conditions that I put up before for a collaborative process. But we use these to guide both formal or informal assessments of the appropriateness of our involvement in a given policy situation. And these are our services. Again, I don't think I have time to do a lot of walking through these, but consultation is a collaborative approach worth exploring. Situation assessments, interview-based key informant interviews with people knowledgeable about the issues to understand if the circumstances are right and how to structure a process. And if so, then that informs collaborative process design, how to design a fair and productive process. Facilitation and project management, helping groups be more effective. Capacity building, applied learning, shared information base, are some of those services. And so just wrap up with a couple quick project examples. in the Chehalis Basin since 2011. That's in southwest Washington State. We've been providing facilitation, coordination, and other services that have broken almost a century of stalemate and conflict on how to mitigate catastrophic flooding and enhance greatly reduced fisheries. It's been informed a lot by the Yakima Basin Plan. There's a lot of similarities, both about water and fish, although instead of dealing with scarcity of water, you're dealing with overabundance at the wrong time. But a lot of the dynamics are the same. What do you think about that graphic? The point of this graphic is that the recreation fee system in the state of Washington is too complicated. As anyone who recreates outdoors will know. So the legislature asked us to coordinate a process to develop options and recommendations to improve consistency, equity, simplicity in the fee system while accounting for fiscal health and stability of land management. Also recently, the coastal entities in Grays Harbor County on the Washington coast partnered with Congressman Kilmer's office and the Department of Ecology for us to assess long-term resilience opportunities in Washington's coastal communities. And that's in response to growing concerns about impact on infrastructure and the natural environment from erosion, flooding, landslides, the number and severity of storms, predictions about rising sea levels, and the potential for a large earthquake and tsunami. So nothing big, just that. I'm trying to do a sort of a range of projects. The most deadly landslide in state history and potentially in the nation happened in Snohomish County in 2014. Actually, yesterday was the anniversary of that slide. Took 43 lives, and we facilitated a commission that the governor and county executive put together to come up with recommendations to help plan and respond to similar events. I was speaking with somebody earlier today about the largest situation assessment I'm aware of, which we conducted on Columbia River salmon and steelhead, and NOAA Fisheries asked us to explore what the future of recovery ought to look like, and that's led to a new sovereign and stakeholder regional forum. Actually, Urban Eberhard is serving on that forum. And then, as Kevin mentioned, he's leading our development of a health policy area of practice and has done a number of proof of concept projects, one here in the Yakima Basin, and then moving on to some more fully blown projects for health districts, health coalitions, accountable communities of health. So just to wrap things up, lots of other projects we could talk about. I teed up there a number of recurring lessons, and we've actually been talking about a lot of these things during the day, including definitions of consensus and having everyone at the table who needs to be there for implementation, starting with a shared vision. We can get into some of these concepts during discussion. I'll try and bring them back up as they become appropriate. And then these are some discussion questions I thought about, but we'll see if they're appropriate to bring back. As you can see, our collaboration and compromise, the same thing, and other stuff like that. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what collaborative governance means to the center, what it means to do this work from a university setting, and the Ruckelshaus Center as an example.
So while she's setting it up, I'll just make a couple of comments. One can think of collaborative governance as coming from multiple places. One is very organic. I mean, people all over the place are coming together to do improvements in their watersheds, for example, without any external facilitation. And there are external facilitators that are in the private sector who obviously have to be for profit. But then there are the university-based ones with multiple sources of funding. And so that's kind of Michael was talking about. Is this working? Yeah. Oh, good. So, so I'm asking the question, what can academics offer practitioners of collaborative governance? Michael's a pracademic. He's a professor at Washington State University, but he's a practitioner as well. But one of the ideas about having a university-based collaborative governance center is that academics perhaps can tell something to practitioners they don't know. We'll see how much that's true. So premises of of university-based collaborative governance. I should note the Ruckelshaus Center is at both Washington State University and University of Washington, which is great because you get both sides of the state. I put up a beautiful picture of the University of Washington there because the cherry blossoms are actually blooming right now. So premises, one is that universities can provide more legitimacy for the process. And I say can because some people don't perceive universities as being inherently neutral. Lots of people would say, oh, the University of Washington is crawling with a lot of liberals. Why should we trust them out on the east side? So it's not a broad claim. Another is that universities can provide two kinds of expertise. One is just topical. So I do environmental policy stuff, and I might be able to provide the Ruckelshaus Center some thoughts on environmental topics, but also having to do with how well, what do scholars know about how well different kinds of collaborative processes work? Because to scholars like me, the big question is, and I put best practice in quotes because best practices, this is what I nicely call folk knowledge, folk wisdom. It's what professionals believe is best. It's a belief, and probably that's correct, but academics are hard-nosed, and academics want to use various methods to say, given they use these practices, what were the results? So hopefully we can advise on that as well, what practices seem to work consistently. And the other, Nicola's smiling, so she's clearly got that one loaded up. And sometimes, I go out and give talks to practitioners who do this, and I start raising this kind of stuff, and it gets edgy because people don't want to hear critiques too much of practice. Uh-oh. It's not moving. So, what do academics know about collaborative governance? First thing I want to point out is this book that Michael actually just gave a shout out to, 2015. This, if you want to buy an academic book on collaborative governance, this is the one. Particularly if you're doing environment, because Kirk Emerson has been a pracademic in that area for quite a while. And it gets pretty theoretical at times, but it's the best, most encompassing work on collaborative governance there is. And it often, its purpose is to provide practitioner advice. So I'm just going to go through some things that are generally known from academics. One is this idea of failing into collaboration. And that's not my term, but we know, and Bruce knows because he had to read my dissertation back in the 1990s, that collaboration is very difficult for a lot of reasons. One is just the competing interests and beliefs that were discussed in the prior panel, for example, but there's also just oodles of institutional constraints having to do with the structure of government, institutional constraints of bureaucratic action, private property rights, the list goes on. So even if people are very well-meaning and want to do things and overcome their differences, there's a large number of institutional constraints. Therefore, people rarely come together to solve wicked problems until they've exhausted what they can achieve in other venues, like courts. And you heard it in the last panel. Sue, we're not getting anywhere. We have to change the venue. We got to do something different. This is where the language of failing into collaboration comes from. And environment, it's the courts that usually is the venue that fails for people, and then they opt out of the court venue. So what's the general lesson? This gets back to a point Bruce mentioned early. Good intentions to get ahead of problems like flooding in the Bay Area due to climate change through collaborative planning and management are likely to bear very little fruit because you're trying to get ahead of something, and even in an area where most people believe this is going to happen, there are so many barriers to doing this that I would predict that nothing's going to happen that we would want to happen because people haven't failed into collaboration yet. But we're being very proactive, which is a good thing. Venue shopping. So collaboration itself, collaborative partnerships, whether Michael's organization or others create these venues for collaboration, they're they're venues for problem solving. So are courts, so are legislatures, so are special districts, local governments, et cetera. And people shop for venues. They go to where they think they can get what they want. And collaborative partnerships tend to be the venue of last resort, or people are failing into it. Therefore, people are constantly thinking about other venues where they can get what they want. And I think we heard it in the last panel. People are thinking, like the environmental groups, can I get something better by suing? Do I have to buy into this? It's going to be hard to get them to the table. I didn't put that question directly to Peter, though I wanted to. So the standard language in the business is BATNAs. People have in their minds best alternative to negotiated agreements. They're floating around, and that BATNA has to deal with another venue. And since collaborative partnerships are voluntary, I don't believe it's worthwhile talking about collaborative partnerships unless you're talking about them in terms of being voluntary. People can venue shop, they can leave, and because they can leave, it creates power imbalances because the people with the resources to implement whatever the partnership agrees to have to be kept in by the others. So participants without BATNAs, meaning they can't go anywhere else and win, are more likely to concede their positions to those with BATNAs when the latter have the resource endowments. They've got the money, they've got the institutional leverage, they have the authorization to make something happen, like the Bureau of Reclamation. So what's the lesson? Public officials and mediators, like the Ruckelshaus Center, need to find ways to reduce these power imbalances to enhance fairness in outcomes. It has to do with various kinds of decision-making processes that would enhance that. Michael might want to speak to that. He's the expert. Might have to do with giving money to certain people to allow them better access to participation, et cetera. But the very idea of venue shopping creates these power imbalances. Trust building, you heard this in the last one, is exceedingly important. We have lots of research on this, and whenever I'm involved in these kinds of meetings and I hear groups talk, lots of it just keeps coming back to trust. That's why I asked Peter what he meant by trust, because there's many different meanings. But if you're negotiating interests among lawyers, that's relatively easy compared to trying to come to consensus when beliefs diverge hugely. And they can be beliefs about all sorts of things, like the quality of science, the feasibility of policy tools. By that I just mean if you implement this kind of engineering solution or this kind of regulation, something will happen. There's all sorts of kinds of beliefs people have, and when you get these differences in beliefs, trust matters a lot more. In part because individuals devil shift, I love this term. They stigmatize their adversaries, often even not knowing they're doing it, by painting them to be evil, crazy, stupid, that's a wacky idea, crazy environmentalist, et cetera. And so you have to start overcoming these types of beliefs. So trust building, we know from a fair amount of research, overcomes the devil shift. You have to bring people together over long periods of time. So they go out to the arboretums and do all these kinds of things. I didn't plant that when they were saying that. To get to know each other and to trust them, breed transparency. We like this person. He's not crazy. He's not going to try to kill me. So the lesson, collaborative processes must be designed to allow trust to grow. It means they're very long-term, and you have certain kinds of decision-making processes, and you want to think about types of things you're going to discuss. Michael discussed situation assessments. You figure out what the hot-button issues are, and you design a process that's going to lead to this kind of open decision-making. So deliberation just means that you're creating a process where people are willing to come in and rethink their beliefs. They're not just going to come in and hammer their positions over and over. This takes a lot of time. And trust is huge. How am I doing for time? Oh, 5. The halo effect, very important. So participants, this is the academic in me speaking, participants with long-term commitments to a collaborative process tend to believe the process is producing more positive outcomes than non-participants. This is the halo effect. And this happens for multiple reasons. One, it happens to do with venue shopping, with exit. So people Some people choose not to come in the first place, as Peter noted in the last one, because it's not a good venue for them. Therefore, they're not going to be happy, but they're outside. Others will get tired and leave, or they'll go venue shopping. And so it's exceedingly important to keep in mind that the people who stay in over years tend to be the happier ones. But there's another thing going on as well. This is cognitive psychology. There's lots we know from academic about cognitive distortions in people's decision making. And so even if you're keeping everybody in, there's lots of things that start happening. So people get confirmation bias. They see what they want to see. They think that their process is working really well, so then they see and point to those things as examples and don't look at other things. They get sunk cost bias or sunk cost fallacy, which is where you believe that the things you've committed to yourself, like a particular maybe storage device or whatever, you have to keep going at it because you put in so much time already. But as any economist knows, the sunk cost is sunk. Therefore, if it's not such a good decision anymore, you should walk away from it, but people get committed. It's a sunk cost fallacy and optimism bias. These are just classic things that go on in people's minds. So what's the lesson? This one took a while for academics to finally move on from. Don't measure success in terms of participant judgments of effectiveness. It's great to listen to stories. I love to hear them. I love to hear people are happy and staying in processes. It's super important. Urban Eberhardt's, where's Urban? His optimism is infectious. I love it. I'm an optimistic guy, but as an academic, we have to remember that we can't rely on participants' perceptions. You need objective measures. And the Emerson and Abachi book I mentioned has an entire chapter of hundreds of measures of ways you can think about objectively measuring collaborative success. So you have to be really careful because even well-meaning people are highly subject to the halo effect. And science is contested. This is one of the areas I spend quite a bit of time on. We know without doubt that people in collaborative partnerships, people all over the place, undervalue science or misinterpret science or cherry pick scientific findings. Often the misinterpretation is one of the bigger problems. You underestimate uncertainty. It's another cognitive bias people have. So we still don't know much about how well science is actually used, and I've been spending the last couple of years doing various projects on how science is used. We know a lot about how it's used in public agencies and in courts. So if you're really into science, we know a lot about whether those venues would produce science-based decisions well, but we don't know a lot yet about collaborative processes. So one thing my colleagues and I did is we went and looked at a bunch of collaborative documents of partnerships in the Puget Sound. I'm on the salty west side, and if we rake through them using various coding techniques, meeting minutes and plans, et cetera, and there's very little discussion of science. There's very little discussion, even though these are all ecosystem recovery efforts. There's very little evidence of science-based solutions. And so it's easy to look at that and say, oh, well, it's true. They don't use science. But so then we went out and did a huge slew of focus group interviews with these groups. And one of the key things we found is actually many of them actually want to use science, and they are scientists. They're natural resource professionals with master's degrees, but they feel silenced by their organization. They might be reporting to elected officials in their local government or special district or their agencies. And so actually they're having these kinds of discussions, and science is smack in the middle of it. But when they write things up, they have to leave it out. We were told stories about you can't even use the word climate change, global warming. Can't even use the word science because some organization, remember people who are at the table are representing organizations, they know what they can say, and therefore if you just go to the documents, you might say, oh, well, these are not science-based. But there's larger reasons for that. There are big institutional constraints, like I started with. These interviews were very, very interesting and depressing. Do not expect collaborative processes to reach decisions based heavily on science for a number of reasons. And it's not the participants' fault necessarily. We know public agencies and courts generally rely more heavily on science because we have laws like the Administrative Procedure Act that force that, but they're not perfect either with regard to use of science. We know that. So, over time, but only by a minute. So now we'll get into some actual research.
All right. Yeah, so as Craig alluded to, I'm going to be drawing on a variety of different studies that I have done over the last few years, looking at collaborative governance, primarily in the space of the siting and operations of large water infrastructure. And I'm not gonna dive into any one study. I'm gonna be really trying to glean some benefits and challenges of collaborative governance to get a sense of some of the types of evaluations that Craig was talking about. And I just want to note, so, I am gleaning over. I'm happy to get into the details of any study if people are curious, either in the Q&A or afterwards. And the studies are going to be coming from two primary cases. The first is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's process for licensing hydropower dams here in the US. And this is a 5+ year process where dam owners, usually water or electrical utilities, work jointly with regulatory agencies, environmental resource agencies, nonprofit organizations, and community groups to conduct a series of technical studies to evaluate the impacts of dams, and then propose a new management or operating requirements for the dams. So this actually, unlike the case Craig's research, this is actually a very science-based and is required to be a science-based process. The other case is California's Integrated Regional Water Management Program. And this is a program where it was designed to be watersheds, but that hasn't happened. Regions within California are coming together to set joint priorities for building water security at the regional scale. And then individual organizations are invited to apply for funding for projects that fit within that regionally defined plan. And I want to note that both of these cases are what I would call a mandatory collaboration, so top-down collaboration. We have a central government agency, either the federal or the state level, telling people at the local level, okay, you have to collaborate. What that ends up happening is that there are some people who do really, really well and work really closely together, and other people who have no idea what to do and kind of do a minimum level of required consultation. They have a couple outreach meetings and call it good enough. So what that means is that we can compare across all of these different approaches and try to really glean, okay, what does a more collaborative process do that a less collaborative process doesn't? Okay. So very briefly, what are some of the benefits of collaborative governance that I've seen? The first is, at least in the case of FERC relicensing, that it actually can serve to help decision makers incorporate scientific information into their management recommendations. And this is coming out of a 5-year ethnographic study of 2 ongoing relicensing processes in California's Central Valley. And one of these cases was highly collaborative as they were developing all of the various models that they were using to understand what impact the dams were having. So it was built by a couple of engineering consultants, but then they were meeting with the full stakeholder group a couple of times a month to share the latest updates to the models, get feedback, sort of ground truth, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and really iteratively over time developing the final product. In the other dam, the models were also built by engineering consultants, but they were completely finished, And then they held a series of 5 consultation workshops to train people on how to use the models. And in the more collaborative process, this model became the core sort of object around which all negotiations happened. So whether it was a decision that was one organization way out on its own saying, hey, we should do this, or an idea where it was the whole group coming together to refine something, they would run that new idea through the model, and it would spit out something that looked like this, and they would talk about, okay, what does this mean? How can we refine that? In the other case, I actually found 0 evidence from all of the interviews and people that I've talked to that nobody used the model, basically. So all this money went into developing the model because they were required to do so by law, and nobody used it. That's a pretty big difference. Another benefit is that collaboration helps people in these processes understand and manage the many types of uncertainty that arise during a collaborative process. So we heard about a number of these during the Yakima Basin, and some of these are uncertainty about, okay, what's going to happen? What will happen under climate change in these systems? How will these environmental groups who aren't a part of the process, what are they going to do that might disrupt what we're trying to do internally? And what I've seen is that for some types of uncertainty, these can be resolved by exchanging information. And so if you're bringing together a bunch of people with a lot of different expertise, they can work together to figure out, okay, what permits do we need to do to conduct this study? And there will inevitably be somebody in the room, hey, I'm from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that's going to be a stream bed alteration agreement, and I'm going to go back and work with my network, and we'll make that move quickly. A lot of other uncertainties, though, they can't necessarily be resolved by creating more information. It's dealing with things like, hey, we're in a huge drought, and we don't actually know if and when it's ever going to rain for us to be able to do this study that we need to do. But with that, by building trust, building relationships, they were able to come to a sort of workaround to jointly decide, okay, what are we going to do? What level of scientific information is enough for us to move forward with a management recommendation? And really making sure that everybody was on the same page, that nobody felt left out of this process. Looking towards some of the outcomes, I've compared dozens of the actual licenses that are developed under FERC relicensing. And what you see is that more collaborative processes yield stronger and more tailored environmental protections. And just for a quick example of this, this is comparing 2 dams. This is, first of all, from a dam actually in Georgia, so not in the American West, unfortunately. But the sole operating requirement in this license that had anything to do with where water would go in the system and when was that flows downstream of the dam should not exceed 750 cubic feet per second, and that was in place to protect a downstream city that got its water supply from the river. So there was nothing in there that was going to affect how much electricity the dam owners could generate. In contrast, this is from a dam up here in Washington, a very highly collaborative process. And this is just one of many, many tables that dictated where water should go and when. And what you can see is it's very, very detailed. They break down at a monthly and sometimes even weekly level what the minimum flow requirements are, maximum flow requirements are, based on what resources they needed to protect and when are salmon spawning in the river, when is it big recreational time and we need to make sure there's enough whitewater flows. And also setting maximum fluctuation levels on the reservoir so that they could protect recreational activity on the reservoir itself. So a lot of different types of interests being met in this one license and achieved through collaboration. An interesting finding too is that overall, we've heard a lot about collaboration takes time. It takes time to build these relationships, it takes time to build trust. But when you actually look at the full duration of these collaborative processes, so from when they have their first meeting to when they actually receive their new operating license, on average, more collaboration doesn't actually take more time. And I think part of what's going on here is that, yes, it maybe takes time up front to develop those relationships, But then it's much faster going through all of the sort of external review because you have all of the various regulatory agencies on board with what they're already doing. And maybe there's fewer, I'm hypothesizing here on some of the mechanisms, but there's also likely fewer lawsuits. Not to say that every single process I've studied has had a lawsuit, but maybe less disagreement overall. And so when you look at just the overall duration, it doesn't actually take more time to collaborate. All right. So now onward and into some of the challenges. These are very many, and we've heard a lot about some of them. I'm just going to pull out a couple. One is in the case of mandatory collaboration, where people are at the local level are being told to collaborate. A big challenge is getting the people who are going to convene these processes, so the people who own these dams, who don't want to collaborate, to actually work openly. And this is a letter that was written by one of the projects that I studied in California, where there were a number of letters written to FERC, to the regulatory agency, saying, hey, this utility needs to collaborate more. What they're proposing isn't good enough. And the utility responded with a letter to FERC that said, the dam owners are not certain what the California Department of Fish and Wildlife intends by the phrase collaborative process. It's the belief of the utility that it's more efficient for us to develop the initial packages of hydrology and model logic prior to meeting with relicensing participants. And if you ask any of the people up on this panel, we would tell you, no, that's actually a really bad idea. You need to get them involved up front. They'll tell you what are they interested in, and then that'll help you build the model in a way that they'll actually use it. And similar challenges exist for getting other stakeholders to the table. We've heard a lot about this, but the environmental groups, if they don't, in the Yakima Basin, if they don't feel like their interests are going to be met, or if there's a better venue for them to go to, then they're not going to show up. Another challenge is keeping people at the table. And so this is switching gears now to the Integrated Regional Water Management Program. And this is data from a 10-year period of all of the various meetings. And each color is a different type of organization. So water utility, or a nonprofit organization, or a municipality. And what you can see is over time, similar distribution of organization types are showing up to these meetings. So, there's a pretty good mix. We've got pretty good diversity of people showing up. But if you look at the actual likelihood that a particular organization attends over time, the picture looks pretty differently. And here, so the vertical axis is the frequency of meetings for a particular year attended, and then on the horizontal axis, we've got each year. And what you can see is people, and these are, oh, sorry, I'll go back. There we go. So these are also people who are attending more frequently. So left panel is people who attend 80 or more percent. I think it's 80% of meetings or more. I'm looking at my co-author, Iris. And middle is people who attended sort of in the 40 to 80%. And then people are on the right are people who didn't attend all that regularly. But across all of these different groups, people started off high, they attended more meetings, and then over time they dropped off. And I've seen there's similar patterns if you look at data from some of the longer term FERC relicensing processes that I've studied as well, where it's really, really hard to keep people at the table. And this actually has big implications for the quality of decisions that are being reached, because in the case of IRWM, the people who attended meetings more frequently were also more likely to have the projects that they proposed funded. So this has some pretty big implications for equity, because if you think about, okay, who are the organizations that have the resources to continue attending over time? In this case, it's going to be the larger water agencies and not some of the smaller municipalities or nonprofit organizations. So in sum, this is very, very broad sweeping. Collaboration is really, really useful when it's done well, but it's also super challenging to implement. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much, Bruce, for the invitation. I'm going to stand there. And when I was told that I was the last speaker, I became really worried. I thought that these people will hate me because I'm in the middle of a very nice reception. But for all of you, in attention to all of you very brave people that endured till the end of a very interesting but long day, I'm gonna to keep it brief. And in case I get lost, I lost track of the time because I become too excited talking about the Tijuana River watershed, then Iris is going to remind me that I need to finish. Okay, let's start. I'm going to present a case study, a successful case study of cross-border collaborative governance. Okay. And four other parts of this brief presentation. I'm not going to go in detail. There is much information there, and if you need or want to talk about this, we can talk about at the reception, okay? You can have the presentation. I think Bruce is in it. Okay. I'm going to touch four parts. The first is to introduce to you, I don't know if all of you have heard about the Tijuana River watershed. For sure you have, yes. And then two studies that I'm going to tell you later why these are important, and some final comments. Well, this is an example of successful cross-border collaborative governments that it was developed at two universities. This is my institution, El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. We work together with San Diego State University to develop, this was the last product, the product that grounded a collaboration of that it was, how can I go back? Okay, yeah. Of over a decade. We started to talk, yes, and we wanted to talk. And then we initiated a process that it took a lot of patience, a lot of respect, and to start comparing definitions of what we meant, but each of the concepts that we believed that they were important. And then this atlas summarizes that work. It has two parts. One is on the physical characteristics of the Tijuana River watershed, and the other, the second part, there are around 10 parameters of environmental and social environmental conditions. Yeah? The Tijuana River watershed is 450,000 hectare area shared between the United States and Mexico. Precisely, it will be the northwestern Baja California, Tijuana, and Tecate, and the southwestern California, San Isidro and Imperial Beach. 75% of that area is located, sorry, in Mexico. But it is very interesting because of the topography, that is an elevation that goes from sea level altitude to 2,100 meters above sea level. It drains from the United States and Mexico to form the Tijuana River, and crosses the border and discharges in the San Diego Bay area. So this atlas describes very well. I have a copy if you want to, but you can download it from the website on the San Diego State University as well. It's not only a document, we created a GIS system, and you can download all the information that is there. It was published in 2005, but let me tell you more about this Tijuana River watershed. There it is. Look. Is that one. And the border is here. So I told you that its tributaries come from here in the States and from here in Mexico. They form all these small rivers ended in the Tijuana River, and then they drain. This is the temperature, some examples of the maps that you can create. This is the precipitation, hydrography. And in that land that it was used for agriculture, for catering, now it has been lost or conquered to a lot of urban spaces. Now we have huge cities there, Tijuana and Tecate on the Mexican side, and San Isidro and Imperial Beach on the American side. What happens here and why is a problem is that because of the draining and this river crossing the two cities, so this very populated area, there is a lot of wastewater that is discharged into the river. And then we have around a lot of volume of wastewater that is not treated, that goes into the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. So we believe, and of course, because the change of land use, a lot of the biodiversity has been changed, it has accelerated erosion, all the problems that come here with that. So to give you an idea, this is the change of land use. We have Tijuana here. Yeah. We have San Isidro around here, Tecate is around here. But this was 1995, yeah? So more or less they cover this area now and that area over here. And there are more problems. What has happened since then, since 1995? This is an example of some data that gains and losses of net change per land use and vegetation cover. This was taken from Eaton and Melnick. Oops. Yep, okay. And in few words, what you can see that the main gains are in urban, and we are losing So this is a very interesting update of what has happened in the land use and change of land use at the Tijuana River watershed. And of course, because of that, there are more wastewaters that have been generated, more erosion, more fragmentation, more loss of diversity. And on top of everything, we have different jurisdictions and regulatory frameworks there. So this is for the 75% of these are the national, state, and municipal level regulations that we have there. And then we have the national regulations that 7.7% of that is state land. Then we have indigenous reserve, we have a metropolitan area, and we have a federal area for America. And no other regulations that rules over the 25% of the Tijuana River watershed. So it's complex. These guys found that what I just summarized, that the land, the cover of this Tijuana River watershed has been lost to urbanization, but the fragmentation is bigger in the States and in Mexico. Yeah. And what is happening with these two regulatory frameworks at the Tijuana River watershed? Well, yes, there is some planning, but the planning mainly takes place on the American side. And to give you an idea as well, the type of projects that have been developed there on 4 types of activities: wastewater improvement, that was treatment and reclamation plan designed. I'm going to show it to you in a while. But there is also sedimentation control. Look, the differences. Yeah? It's not that the Americans are richer than Mexico is, of course, but there is, as you can see, there is a complete, there is not an agreement to plan or to cooperate, not from the authorities. Well, this is the South Bay International Wastewater Treatment Plant. It has a capacity to treat 25 million gallons per day. Yeah, it is. And it's located in San Diego County, around 2 miles from the San Isidro Port of Entry. And this water treatment plant is here. Yeah. It's treated, the wastewaters that come from Tijuana. On this side is Tijuana, and this is San Diego County. The information that we provided, we expected that after we coordinated data, collected data, harmonized data, and created the Atlas and the GIS system, that it will provide these people with some information to plan. That it hasn't happened. No more from the water treatment plant. What shall we do? And it's a question that we have over these years. Should we add more than provide data, more than to harmonize data, maybe to provide some public policies, strategies, evaluation of the policies? How can we really try to be useful as universities to provide a solution? I like this study quite a lot. It comes from the same time that our Atlas was published. And in few words, she's a academic at, I think, UC Riverside. In few words, she applied some game theory, and then she calculated that it would be easier for San Diego County to invest in Mexico to treat the wastewater over there, and it would be 10 times cheaper than to do it, to continue planning and doing it on the 25% of the Tijuana River watershed. Well, maybe we should be more bold in our proposals. But anyway, if I can summarize, I would say that this exercise that allowed us to have a collaborative governance exercise, it took 4 elements. One of them was trust, that it was built over a decade. It took as well a lot of patience, not to patronize and not to be patronized, to believe that we can talk at the same level and have useful things that can complement each other. I would say that the third was leadership, and the fourth was that we give the unbiased, and mainly in Mexico, with these changes of municipal and state governments that sometimes disrupt the processes of decision making. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, we have approximately 10 or 15 minutes more. I'll start it off just because it does strike me that there are some different meanings or different applications of collaboration that are implicit in here. So, you know, the Craig and you know, the Ruckelshaus people are talking about a situation in which the alternative is a lot of litigation, and that's the fail into, not all of your, I realize not all of yours, but the ones that Craig was focusing on, and certainly in the backdrop of a lot of the water is the notion with FERC and with the integrated water, regional water plans, that if you don't do it, you're going to be in adjudication, you're going to be paying a lot of money, and you're going to not make a lot of progress. There's a second sense in here, which is the governance, the government part, that no matter, even if it's just a bunch of agencies, you have to start dealing with nonprofits, you have to deal with community activists. And so the normal way of agencies operating, where they would maybe make decisions without a tremendous amount of consultation with the local government, that's just not possible anymore. Again, possibly because of litigation, but partly because of expectations of input. And then there's a third meaning of the collaboration, or when it can be used, which is there's no jurisdiction that covers a particular area. So Baja and California have to operate. The federal government is not going to regard the Tijuana pollution problem as an overriding problem, and so it's going to be the neighbors that are most impacted that have to have a conversation, and that was true on the Canadian border with Washington. A lot of the you have the Columbia Water Treaty, but there's a lot of negotiations in localized areas in terms of particular problems with pollution or maintenance of water systems. So it seems to me there are very different types of collaboration. So let's start with the one that I think, Craig, you're talking about, where you have to fail into it because things are so bad. Otherwise, people finally have to talk to one another and build up this trust relationship. I mean, to what degree is the solution? By the way, when I give this lecture, I noticed Brady was here. Did he leave again? I think he did. Oh, no, he's still there. When I gave my lecture on all of this, on collaborative government and all the problems and the fracture and the rest, Professor Brady said at the end of the lecture to the students, he finally saw the argument for Chinese government, that abandoning democracy and having centralized government. And there is that kind of sense of hopelessness about this. But would one answer be to close off some of these legal avenues? You could do this through the Congress, or you could do this through state legislation, but make it a lot harder to go into the courts. Would that have an effect of pushing more people into collaboration, or would it have the opposite effect?
Lawsuits are great. Because lawsuits, if you want environmental outcomes, it's a major way that they've been achieved, and it's what forces people to come together to do collaborative processes. I've studied endangered species, migratory fish, all sorts of environmental issues, and undergirding all of the collaborative efforts is the sense that if you don't do this bigger thing to plan an expansive ecosystemic way, everybody's going to get hammered on the margin. And so cutting off lawsuits, I would argue, is not a good thing, even though I think most lawsuits don't lead to good resolutions in and of themselves, but there's a bigger picture.
Just to add to that, litigation's an important part of the conversation, but anybody who will remember Schoolhouse Rock Saturday mornings decades ago will know that there's actually, I mentioned that collaborative governance kind of arose out of tools and techniques developed from something called alternative dispute resolution, which really came from the legal field, and in that case, the alternative was the alternative to going to court. But ADR in a policy context, the alternative are those three ways that we resolve disputes in a democracy, which is there's a judicial system, but there's also a legislative system, and there's an executive system. So when a collaborative governance process happens, it's about it's not supplanting those means of dispute resolution. It's taking the issue aside for a while, putting it into a collaborative process that has those stages and those features that I was talking about. But then the results, if an agreement is reached, the results are returned to one or more of those venues. So sometimes it's that people have sued each other and it hasn't resolved the issue. And Craig is right that it's a great place to raise a venue. It's sometimes you do need that. You need the black and white of a decision, a judge or a jury's decision to say, this is a legal right that was not being recognized. It is now going to be recognized. Or, no, that does not exist. That will not happen. But the complexity that a wicked problem relies, usually a judge is not able to just, to address that. But a lot of times we get problems that have been stuck in a legislative situation forever. And when Craig talked about BATNAs and people assessing what their best alternatives are, they're not just looking at, can I go sue if I don't get what I want here? They're saying, can I get a legislative, can I do a agency end run? Can I get this from the governor? Do I have 51 votes in the state legislature? So, and then in terms of the failing into collaboration, that's pretty typical, and you've heard a lot of examples of that. But one of the things Bill Ruckelshaus likes to say is it's better to build a fence at the top of the cliff than send an ambulance to the bottom. which is kind of a nice folksy way of saying that these same tools and techniques that are so useful for resolving disputes and helping people who, for example, in the Chehalis Basin have an 80-year history of not making progress, you take those and you apply them. The term we like to use is apply them upstream. If you go upstream and apply those same tools and techniques, then you can make even more amazing things happen. And again, it's not so black and white. I mean, like in the Yakima, you've got some litigation fatigue leading, but they're also now doing some things that are upstream on some other problems that are keeping those from ever having to get there. Our work on coast resilience is another good example.
Okay, well, I want to get everybody involved. So let me ask a question first to Nicola, and then I'll have one for Gabriela. So here's my concern about stakeholders and the public being involved. We haven't talked much about this, but the people that are not part of the government agencies that show up, there ain't no rules about who has to be there. So if you have an environmental hearing in the Bay Area, we are chock-a-block with nonprofit groups. We have NIMBYs that pretend to be nonprofit groups. So, but if you go to remoter areas, more conservative areas, you don't have all those environmental groups. So it seems to me you're setting up a situation of enormous regulatory variance, right? Because it's going to depend upon who shows up. And if some areas you don't have as well organized a nonprofit sector, you're going to have a different set of interests. What guarantees that we're having anything like uniform application of the law if we're going to be taking all this arbitrary public input that will be highly dependent upon the particular geography?
So that's a great question, and I guess I have two responses there. One is a lot of, I pointed out the dropout over time. And I think that really what ends up happening is that, yes, there are some, more disadvantaged groups, low-income communities and things like that, who are kind of forced out for resource reasons. But at the same time, you're also ending up over time with a core set of organizations who actually have a stake in whatever the decision is that's being made. And so because these are 5, 10, 20-year processes, that NIMBY group, they're going to show up to the first couple meetings and rant for a while. And maybe they might show up once every 5 years, but they're not going to be super engaged in the process. The second point is I think that regular regulations are also vastly differently implemented across areas. So actually, in a study totally not about collaboration, but on permitting, I've been coding a bunch of Clean Water Act permits for the Southwest region. And these are all permits issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And every single district has, within the Southwest region, there are 4 different offices. And every single office has totally different practices, and these permits look totally, totally different. And so, this idea of regulatory uniformity, I think, is a myth, and I don't think that you're getting any more or less uniform protection, whether it's collaborative or a regular command and control.
That's an empirical prediction, and we'll see whether that's true or not at some point, right, Nicola? Okay, so Gabriela. Here's my question to you. It turns out that Tijuana is growing and has a big food scene now, and you have wine tours down in Ensenada that we did that are quite beautiful. And there's a whole bunch of Americans that are living condominiums up and down now the coastline of this. Does this open up the possibility of doing what we were able to do in Canada, which is to really have serious conversations now, because there are all these Americans that are on the other side of the border? Does the presence of the emigres in any way, or the temporary residents, or all the people that are in the condominiums, does that change the sort of, did they enter into the discussion about the environment, about these conditions, or are they sort of silent within the Baja community?
No, actually, yeah, okay. And you forgot there is a huge medical tourism. Huge. They go there temporal for because it's cheaper from plastic surgery to the dentist. Let's say. And for me, I wasn't born in that region, and it was quite surprising to see that it was quite integrated. Actually, a lot of condominiums were left empty after September 11th, when the problems of crossing the border were very strict. I mean, they were high, and there were 5 hours least and queues to cross the border before you could cross it in 20 minutes. And but yes, to be fair, the American communities are most of them are quite active. I mean, they have long histories. There are families, so they are not quite separated. So yes, they are quite active. Human rights, animal rights, environmentalists. Yes, they are quite.
So I'm asking this question because when I look at the problem of the Tijuana River, as far as Mexico is concerned, they got a good deal, because the wastewater treatment plant is on the American side, paid for by American dollars. So you basically shipping your pollution to the north and letting the Americans pay. Why would the Mexicans want to get in any kind of collaborative agreement when they got a good deal right now? What's in it for Mexico, in other words?
Okay, Americans they pay everything. We pay 15%.
Oh, you pay 50%.
Yeah.
So we already got our money.
Yeah, exactly. No, okay. Why is that? Is the kind of thinking that the people of the government have,
Yes.
not us, not the community. And why to collaborate? Because this is only one example. Now that you talk about two conflicts over water, we have the All-American Canal, in which America decided to line a canal that brings water from the Colorado River to San Diego. Because of that, we estimated that 15 to 35% of the infiltration to the groundwater reservoir that we share were lost. There was some producers of asparagus in Mexicali that sued San Diego County. They lost.
Right.
Because there is a terrible waste of water.
Okay, let's open it up. Pat, you had a question, and maybe we'll, and then we'll let, yeah, go ahead. The question was, if the losers had to pay the litigation costs, would that improve collaboration prospects?
So using the traditional rational choice perspective in political science, I'd say absolutely, sure, because you make venue shopping expensive.
I would agree, yeah.
I think it might change people's BATNAs, right? You might look at that and say, well, is a collaborative approach a better alternative because I face this other risk? But I also, one of the recurring lessons that I put up from our experience is that if collaboration is not voluntary, that the prospects for reaching a solution can go way down. That's not to say that you don't see the advantages, like Nicole's seeing in those FERC processes where they're mandating collaboration. Doesn't mean it can't be of value, but you really can have people at the table because they have to be there, not because they want to. And so you might find some of that as well, where people are there because they're afraid to go to the venue that they really want to go to. So you could do a lot of wheel spinning, I think.
Okay. Phil?
A hypothetical question. Let's say, I don't know the name of this county. Let's say it's Yakima County. Is that the correct place? So we're in Yakima County. And you have, in health and healthcare, you have the 5 Ps. You have personal health, you population health, you have public health, you have place and political will. Now, if you were looking at your methodology, where they all have different stakeholders and different purposes and different constituencies, does the process of collaborative governance potentially launch this to a different level where there's a sense of a needs assessment of what's going on and where it is going on? Or is there a different methodology? Because you don't want to go into Craig's mission statement on law, okay? So is this a commission orientation that you set up to start this going? Is it a collaborative initiative? Or is there another process that's efficient and effective to get motivation so all people are on the same place as you move forward?
Particularly with respect to healthcare? Is that what you're
This is,
yeah.
I'm just giving you hypotheticals. And so it came up today, is Mike still here? Yeah, my mentor there. He's talking about, which really was exciting, but is also opportunistic, about creating a blue zone approach for those who are aware or not aware of blue zone. There are places around the world that the longevity is like 10 years greater than all other places. And in the United States, there's a place in Oregon, either Klamath Falls or Granite Falls, that has it's Granite? Granite Pass. So all I'm asking all of you, because I really was enlightened by your presentations, the question is, if not this, what's this? And is there a continuum in the definition of what's before collaborative governance and what's the legal thing? Are there other methodologies? That's a little bit more complex than the question I'm raising, but I'm really trying to find out the methodology using this. Is this the right way to go to get efficiency, effectiveness, and utilize the resources available in a positive manner?
I'll defer to Michael, but I just want to start by saying there is no one methodology. Collaborative governance is just a style of working together across boundaries that has variation in things like degree of voluntary participation, voting rules, all sorts of stuff. So there is no one method. But Michael can talk about their method.
Well, I think Craig is right on, and we talked a little bit earlier, and Kevin could say a lot more about what you need to do to take the methodology or those phases or stages and apply them to a sector like healthcare. You need to do some thinking and adapting of methodology to the circumstances of that situation. But in terms of what you were saying, I mean, yes, I think it's important. It's not so much it's very adaptable. The key point is those stages. And so, for example, I don't think regardless of the subject matter, it is important that people get on the same page and are sharing a fact pattern. And that's why the science, so I think what Craig was saying earlier, whether it's healthcare or it's Puget Sound cleanup or whatever, it is really important that sound science is used. And some collaborative processes don't do a good job of it and skip over it, and sometimes for political reasons, as you mentioned. But there's other examples. I think you mentioned a number of them. I was thinking of a couple of our processes, like our work in the Spokane River, the work in Chehalis. In the Chehalis, we had the same situation where a model that nobody could agree on. When they were not collaborating, nobody could agree on models, nobody could agree on science. And then when the collaboration got strong, that's when they started to, you do the fact finding together, you agree who the sources of information are going to be, which I think is very important for health policy as well. And all of a sudden, once you agree on a model, and then you say that's where we're going to go, and here's the facts we're going to put in there, and we're going to agree that we have confidence in the results, you're probably not going to get to the implementation, the agreement seeking and implementation phases, if you don't come to a shared information base, and a collaborative process, when well structured, can really help make sure that happens. Sometimes these processes, the fatigue isn't just that they've been suing each other. The fatigue is that they've been trying to agree on the science for decades and haven't gotten there. So a collaborative process can be helpful there, whether it's for healthcare or, or any other kind of policy.
Okay, well, I want to thank our panelists for this very enlightening presentation and taking up the difficult slot of the last slot of the day. Thank you very much for that. And okay, so let's give them a hand first. And then there is a reception and a dinner. So I believe the reception is out in the hallway there. So we have approximately 45 minutes, I think, for the reception. And then there's a dinner, so with a speaker as well. So, okay, thank you very much.